Welcome to the Labor Force Podcast, where we talk about the rise in labor militancy and the fact that capitalism is a rotten deal. I'm your host, Mike Strukin, proud member of New York State United Teachers. Well, let's start with garishness objectified. The annual Met Gala, held this past Monday, of which Jeff Bezos and his wife Lauren were honorary chairs this year. More on that reaction in a moment, but first...
Welcome to the Met Gala, where the theme is technically fashion, but the subtext is who can turn a tax write-off into a personality. Yes, here comes another celebrity dressed like a haunted lampshade, confidently explaining that it's a commentary on late-stage capitalism, which is ironic because this event is late-stage capitalism, just with better lighting. Notice the careful balance tonight. Millions of dollars in diamonds paired with the humble relatability of saying, I thrifted part of this look. Sure you did. Right next to the security guard making $18 an hour. And there's the red carpet walk. Slow, deliberate, as if they're thinking, hey, don't trip. This outfit costs more than a public school's annual budget. Designers call these looks bold. Critics call them visionary. The rest of us call them what happens when you give unlimited money and remove all adult supervision. But really, the Met Gala isn't about fashion. It's about commitment. Commitment to the bit. Commitment to excess. Commitment to answering the question, what if Halloween, but for billionaires? And honestly, respect. Because nothing says art like wearing a chandelier on your head and having everyone pretend it makes sense.
As far as the protest and boycott actions, the New York Times reported, opposition to the Bezoses started almost immediately after they were announced as financial sponsors in February and comes amid a surging anti-rich sentiment nationwide and in New York City, the event's liberal home. The outrage seemingly gained momentum after the city's newly elected mayor, Zoran Mamdani, a Democratic socialist, declared in mid-April that he would skip the gala, breaking with many of his predecessors, saying that his focus is on affordability. And in the weeks leading up to the event, an avid anti-Bezos campaign erupted on New York streets, in subways, and online, where social media users described the event as the Amazon Prime Gala or the Bezos Ball. Reports of skittish stars and upset fashionistas peppered tabloid pages, including rumors of some past guests steering clear. And of course, there was more.
And in New York, this year's Met Gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art faced protests on Monday. The event was sponsored by Amazon's billionaire founder Jeff Bezos and his wife Lauren Sanchez Bezos. Ahead of the gala, the activism group Everyone Hates Elon projected video interviews with Amazon workers onto the Bezos' Manhattan penthouse alongside slogans including, if you can buy the Met Gala, you can pay more taxes, and no red carpet for Trump's billionaires. On Friday, the group placed hundreds of bottles of fake urine inside the Metropolitan Museum of Art, referring to complaints by Amazon workers of having to skip bathroom breaks and urinate in bottles. The group also plastered ads across the city reading, quote, "The Bezos Met Gala, brought to you by the company that powers ICE," a reference to Amazon's cloud computing contract with ICE. Amazon's labor union founder, Chris Smalls, was arrested outside the Met Gala after allegedly jumping a barricade. Meanwhile, labor unions staged a ball without billionaires in Manhattan's meatpacking district as an alternative fashion show to the Met Gala. Amazon, Whole Foods, Washington Post, Starbucks, and Uber workers walked the runway in looks by immigrant designers. This is SEIU President April Verrett.
They can try to take our rights. They can try to redraw the lines. They can try to control the systems, but they will never, ever be able to replicate the brilliance, the creativity, the resilience of the people they are trying to hold down. So this ball without billionaires is not just about fashion. It is about power. It's about telling the truth. That people who sew and care and drive and cook and clean and secure and those that create are the ones who make everything possible. Labor is art.
And yes, if all else fails, hold a red carpet all your own.
billionaire class. Crown jacket class, shimmering in revolutionary red, and grounded by knee-high patent leather boots. She fights for liberation and democracy for all. Let the revolution sparkle. With a self-designed top boldly encouraging us to rise, resist, and reject fascism and oligarchy. Damask looms across the look, and a statement unfolds. Fascism fractures, split, divide. Embrace our shared humanity. Power to the people. Climate chaos arises from a choice to allow certain people to die. It kills through heat waves, floods, hunger, and displacement instead of bullet. But the underlying violence is identical. People can be sacrificed. This loop screams climate emergency. Pay attention. Climate is not a separate issue. Alternative, because we need an alternative to this.
Just come back. Thanks a lot.
Alyssa's maximalist protest fashions are inspired by her spirit queen, Jeremy Jones, who taught her more is more. There is no such thing as too much sparkle, and one should always leave the house with a curated hymnscape, which has kept her and her button maker busy since 2016. Rest to be free. Step into your truth and power. I got no pressure. The oligarchs tyrannical need for control is so desperate because
Now let's again talk about what happens when the global economy runs on a single choke point and that choke point gets squeezed. Because right now, that choke point remains the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 20% of the world's oil flows through it, and thanks to the ongoing Iran war, that flow has been disrupted. The result? Gas prices in the U.S. have jumped about 50% since the conflict began, climbing into the mid-$4 range nationally. Patrick DeHaan, head of petroleum analysis at Gas Buddy, says, quote, "It probably could take beyond a year for gas prices to get back down to pre-war levels." Now, ending the conflict with Iran would not mean that oil inventories would suddenly flood overnight, he said. It will take many months to catch up to rapidly declining oil inventories, including those in the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And if you're sitting there thinking, okay, that's bad, but it's just gas. No, it's never just gas. Gas is the pressure point. It's how geopolitical conflict shows up in your checking account. Because when energy prices spike, everything else follows. Transportation costs go up, food prices creep higher, and suddenly the same paycheck covers less life. Economists are already warning that this kind of oil shock could tip the U.S. toward a broader slowdown or even recession territory if it drags on. And here's the part that should sound familiar. The economy looked like it was holding together just fine before this. Hiring had actually picked up recently. But dig a little deeper, and the labor market was already fragile. What analysts are calling a low-hire, low-fire economy. Employers weren't laying people off en masse, but they weren't exactly eager to hire either. Now layer a war-driven energy shock on top of that hesitation. And what do businesses do? They freeze. They wait. They delay hiring, delay expansion, delay risk. Because uncertainty is the enemy of investment. And right now, uncertainty is basically the main export of global capitalism. And as a matter of fact, a deeper look at April's jobs report suggested the U.S. labor market may be weaker than the headline numbers indicate. While payroll data showed stronger than expected job growth, Reuters reported that employment measured through the household survey has actually fallen by more than 1.3 million so far this year, while the labor force has shrunk by roughly 700,000 since early 2025. Labor force participation has now declined for 5 straight months, helping keep the unemployment rate artificially stable at 4.3%. Reuters noted that the labor market is increasingly dependent on a shrinking pool of available workers rather than broad hiring strength. The report also showed job growth becoming increasingly narrow, concentrated mostly in healthcare and service industries, while manufacturing and other sectors struggled. Factory employment fell again in April, continuing a broader decline that Reuters linked to trade uncertainty and slowing economic momentum. Analysts warn that the combination of weaker household employment data, declining participation, and uneven hiring suggests the labor market may not be as strong as the payroll figures imply. So the foundation is shaky. One external shock, like, say, a war that sends oil prices soaring, and suddenly that progress stalls out. And here's the bigger picture we don't talk about enough. This isn't a bug in the system, of course. It is the system. We've built an economy where working people are downstream from global supply chains, corporate pricing power, and geopolitical conflict. You don't control oil markets. You don't control shipping lanes, but you absolutely feel the consequences when they break. Meanwhile, some sectors, energy traders, major oil companies, can actually profit from the volatility. The chaos is expensive for workers, but it's often lucrative for capital. So when gas jumps 50%, it's not just a story about fuel, it's a story about power. Who has it? Who absorbs the shocks? And who gets squeezed every time the system hits turbulence? And that's not just geopolitics, that's design. A system so efficient, it can turn war into profit and your paycheck into collateral damage. And here's a telling observation. According to Yahoo Finance, a growing majority of Americans are more afraid of running out of money in retirement than of dying, highlighting a sharp rise in financial anxiety tied to inflation, healthcare costs, and economic uncertainty. Citing recent survey data, nearly 7 in 10 Americans have this worry, reflecting a significant increase in concern compared to just a few years ago. These fears are driven by factors such as volatile markets, uncertainty around Social Security, and the challenge of funding longer lifespans, with many Americans lacking clear financial plans to navigate retirement. The article emphasizes that this anxiety cuts across income levels and generations, underscoring a broader sense of insecurity about long-term financial stability in the current economic climate. And speaking of gas prices, what about that car payment? According to CNBC, rising car prices, high interest rates, and longer loan terms are putting significant financial pressure on American households, with auto debt reaching record levels and monthly payments consuming a growing share of income. Many buyers are stretching loans to 6, 7, or even more years just to make payments manageable, but this often increases total costs and leaves borrowers financially vulnerable. As the report notes, quote, higher interest rates are driving up car payments, while Americans continue taking on larger loans as vehicle prices remain elevated. The result is a widespread affordability squeeze, with more consumers falling behind on payments or struggling to balance car costs alongside other rising expenses, highlighting how transportation, once a routine expense, has become a major source of economic strain. Meanwhile, yeah, you need a new washer and dryer. But an Axios report highlighted how economic anxiety and the frozen housing market are reshaping consumer behavior, with more Americans choosing to repair appliances instead of buying new ones. Appliance giant Whirlpool warned that consumer demand for appliances plunged soon after the war began, describing the downturn as a recession-level industry decline. The slowdown has hit Whirlpool hard. The company slashed its profit forecast for 2026, suspended its dividend, and saw its stock fall to a 14-year low after reporting weak sales and mounting financial pressure. Reuters reported that high interest rates and low housing turnover are reducing demand for appliances tied to home purchases and renovations, while rising energy prices and inflation are making consumers more cautious. Whirlpool executives said consumers are increasingly delaying purchases and opting for repairs instead, a sign that many households are behaving as though the economy is already in a recession. And what if you're in the market for a mate? Do you turn to gamified dating apps that charge ever larger amounts for premium features? Let's say you match with someone and click well enough to go on that first date. Now we're talking about money. And in that sense, another reflection of this economy.
Half of all Americans say that they've been going on fewer dates due to the state of the economy. Nearly half of all single Americans think dating is not financially worth it. The average date in the U.S. costs $189 as of February 2026, which is up 12.5% from 2025. On top of that, 50% of Gen Z and 40% of millennials say the cost of dating gets in the way of reaching their financial goals.
why would I spend $100 on someone I might not even vibe with?
So we're seeing that there's this increased cost of living, and it's lowering our dating frequency and how we're seeing or perceiving dating. We're seeing people have fewer dinners out, and there's a lower tolerance for higher risk meetups.
Many dating apps are struggling to maintain monthly active users. Wall Street has noticed. The top 2 dating app stocks, Match Group and Bumble, have been on the decline since the end of the pandemic.
So I think it's not just dating, but in general, life becoming more expensive can be an important part of dating and people's ability to find romantic matches.
I think that fundamentally we are looking at broad structural changes that influence people's marriageability or dateability perceptions, both of themselves and of other individuals. And that makes them disinclined to enter into the dating market. For young men in particular, their economic prospects and dating prospects are very much linked and have never, frankly, been more grim.
So what happens when finding love takes more financial risk? Almost everything has gotten more expensive in the past 6 years, and dating's no exception. The typical Gen Z American went on about 9 dates in 2025, and with Gen Z spending about $205 per date on average, that number includes everything such as transportation, clothing, grooming, and what you're actually spending on the date. That works out to roughly $1,845 per year.
Gen Z now ranges from teenagers to people in their late 20s, so there isn't one clean government income figure for the whole generation.
But among full-time workers as of late 2024, median annual earnings were just under $40,000 for ages 16 to 24 and around $59,000 for ages 25 to 34. That means dating accounts for around 3 to nearly 5% of their annual income.
When the cost of living rises, people date much more defensively. They're taking fewer chances and fewer connections are formed.
It's also going to take away from your mental budget, right? You're not going to be able to pay as much attention. You're probably not going to feel as much in mood to feel happy, to channel yourself in the best light. And that's going to take away from your interest in trying to go into these romantic partnerships as well.
All that being said, Derek Thompson published a Substack piece with an interesting title recently, If America's So Rich, How Did It Get So Sad? If you look at the U.S. from a distance, the picture can seem almost absurdly bright. Low unemployment, solid growth compared with other rich countries, rising wages, especially for workers who used to get the smallest share of the gains. By a lot of usual scorecards, this has been a pretty strong decade. And yet, when you ask Americans how they feel, you get something closer to a national shrug or even a wince. Why does a country that's doing so well on paper sound so unhappy out loud? Thompson walks us through a puzzle that's hard to ignore. Since around 2020, American self-reported happiness and satisfaction have dropped sharply, and they haven't really recovered. Call it the opposite of the Roaring Twenties, more like the Tragic Twenties. Let's start with a basic observation. An economist at the University of Chicago, Sam Peltzman, looked at decades of data from the General Social Survey and found something striking. After about 50 years of relatively stable self-reported well-being, there's a sudden step down after COVID. Not a gentle decline, not a slow drift, a break. And it's not just one data set telling the story. Worker satisfaction measures have slid to record lows. Consumer sentiment surveys have cratered to levels that are shocking, even if you remember the Great Recession or the inflationary 1970s. Internationally, the U.S. has fallen to its lowest ever ranking in the World Happiness Report, with young people driving a lot of that drop. So we have two realities at once: a fairly sturdy economy in many traditional respects, and a population that keeps telling pollsters they're miserable. Some people try to wave this away by saying, well, surveys are squishy. Feelings aren't facts. But feelings are a kind of fact. They change how people spend, how they talk, how they treat each other, and how they vote. Mood shapes politics. Politics shapes policy. And policy shapes the economy we're all trying to measure. So if we want to understand where the country is going, we can't treat sentiment like a rounding error. Okay, so what happened? Who killed the vibes? One detail from Peltzman's work is especially important. This isn't just a story about one group. You might assume the biggest decline would be among people who are already more vulnerable to anxiety or loneliness, like younger adults, lower-income households, or people without partners. But the drop shows up everywhere, across age, gender, education, ideology. A broad 10 to 15 point hit, remarkably uniform. That's a clue, because it suggests the cause isn't something niche that affects only one slice of society. Something big happened, and it hit almost everybody. So any explanation has to fit the timeline. It needs to surge around 2020, and then crucially, it needs to linger. That timing knocks out a few popular theories. For instance, some people might point to long-run cultural change, like declining religious affiliation. It's true that religion can correlate with community and meaning for many people, but secularization has been trending for decades. It doesn't match a sudden mood collapse that begins in 2020. Others might say it's inequality. And sure, inequality matters in a lot of ways. But here's the complication. In the years after the pandemic, wage growth at the bottom has actually been unusually strong, and median incomes are higher than they were a decade ago. Plus, some of the steepest happiness declines show up among groups you wouldn't automatically label as economically desperate, like college graduates and older, well-established Americans. So inequality alone doesn't cleanly explain the pattern either. Then there's the obvious villain in so many modern-day stories: smartphones and social media. They're tied up with declining well-being, especially for young people, but that trend started well before 2020. It's more like a slow burn problem that's been building for 10 or 15 years, not a sudden break that happens right when the pandemic hits and then refuses to heal. So if it's not primarily secularization, not primarily inequality, and not primarily just phones, what is it? Here's the simplest umbrella idea. As a cultural and political force, the pandemic never really ended. Not biologically, maybe, but socially, economically, psychologically, we're still living in its aftershocks. You could call it the Permademic, a pandemic that stops being only a virus and becomes a lasting condition of life. Let's break that into a few parts. First, inflation, or more accurately, the lived experience of inflation. Economists tend to discuss inflation as annual rates, a number that rises and falls like a weather report. But households don't experience inflation as a neat average. They experience it as a repeated moment of disbelief. The grocery trip that costs more than it should, the rent renewal that feels like a dare, the restaurant bill that feels like a prank. And while the inflation rate has moved around over the last few years, the cumulative price level is what people actually confront. In the span from 2020 to 2025, consumer prices rose about as much as they did in the long stretch from 2007 to 2020. And housing tells an even more dramatic version of the story. Home prices jump with a speed that made the pre-pandemic years feel calm by comparison. So when everyday life starts to feel like it's sliding out of reach, people don't calm down just because a chart says inflation is cooling. They remember the jump. They remember what things used to cost. Affordability becomes a constant mental itch. There's also an interesting twist here. An economics writer, Matt Darling, has looked at how consumer sentiment typically relates to basic fundamentals like unemployment, inflation, and interest rates. Around 2020, that old relationship breaks. Sentiment plunges far below where you'd predict it should be based on the standard indicators. The gap has a name now, the vibe session, where the vibes are in recession even if the economy isn't, at least not in the typical sense. And surprisingly, the biggest shortfall in sentiment relative to expectations shows up among higher-income households. One explanation is uncomfortable but plausible. In a world of tight labor markets, services that rely on other people's time get more expensive and harder to schedule. Childcare costs more, repairs take longer, eating out costs more, even convenience starts to feel scarce. For decades, many Americans, especially those with more money, got used to frictionless affordability. Then suddenly, the price of convenience rises, and it feels like a loss of control. Not necessarily a loss of income, but a loss of ease. The result is a country that, across the income distribution, feels like it's paying more and getting less. And in democracies, that frustration doesn't stay in private conversation. It turns political. If everything feels unaffordable, voters punish incumbents, even if those incumbents can't easily unwind global supply shocks or housing shortages. That backlash showed up not only in the U.S., but around the world in 2024, when incumbent parties took beating after beating. Now, if inflation is one big part of the story in the U.S., it leads to another question. Why does the West, and especially English-speaking countries, seem hit so hard on happiness measures in recent years, while some other places have seen improved well-being? In the World Happiness Report, countries like China, India, and Vietnam show gains, but much of the decline clusters in the Anglosphere, the US, Canada, the UK, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand. Researchers have suggested that these countries share a few traits that might make them especially vulnerable: a stronger culture of individualism, a very intense and often negative media ecosystem, and what you might call diagnostic expansion, where more conditions get labeled and measured, which increases awareness and reporting of mental distress. There's also a more specific link back to inflation. Some of the European countries that saw happiness rise in the 2020s, like Portugal, Italy, and Spain, also had comparatively lower inflation than places like the UK and Germany. That doesn't prove inflation is the whole story, but it strengthens the case that cost of living shocks are a major ingredient in this decade's sour mood. Okay, that was part one of the Permademic, the economic aftershock, especially inflation and affordability. Part two is institutional trust and how pandemics can change a society's social fabric. Historically, large outbreaks tend to erode trust, and in the US in the 2020s have been a brutal decade for confidence in institutions. Trust has fallen across the board: government, business, education, religion, and many of the expert systems that were thrust into the spotlight during COVID, like public health agencies and medicine. But maybe the more haunting drop is the trust in each other. There's a long-running question in surveys that basically asks, do you think most people would try to take advantage of you, or would they try to be fair? For a long time, Americans leaned toward people are mostly fair. Since 2020, that belief has dropped sharply. And when you stop expecting basic decency from strangers, everyday life becomes more stressful. You approach interactions defensively. You interpret mistakes as malice. You assume the worst, and that mindset is exhausting. At the same time, we've seen a rise in solitude. Americans spend more time alone and more time at home than in previous eras, and that changes what society feels like. Instead of being mediated by the ordinary, humanizing texture of real-world encounters, more of our experience of other people gets filtered through screens and feeds. And online environments tend to reward conflict. Negativity travels faster. Outrage gets amplified. People become symbols of teams rather than neighbors with quirks and decent intentions. Someone you might chat with normally at work or in a bar becomes, on the internet, a villain in a story you're being nudged to believe. Now we get to part three, the 2020s as a perma-crisis decade. Even if inflation had been mild, even if institutions were steady, this has been a period of relentless stressors. Pandemic disruption bleeds into inflation. Inflation bleeds into political backlash. Then add the war in Ukraine, conflict in the Middle East, heightened fear about mass violence, intensifying arguments about borders and culture, and a political atmosphere in the U.S. that often feels apocalyptic to one side and existential to the other. Layer on top of that the new kind of ambient dread that comes with climate anxiety, and now the rising public fear and fascination around AI. It's a lot of threat signals, a lot of alarms, a lot of reasons to feel like the ground is unstable. And the media environment has mirrored that intensity. Analyses of news tone suggest that the news has been more negative than economic and social fundamentals alone would predict, and that gap worsened in the early 2020s. The result is even when the emergency is technically over, the sensation of emergency stays. The virus recedes, but the adrenaline doesn't. So where does that leave us? Here's a verdict that pulls the threads together. The Tragic Twenties aren't primarily a mystery around incomes. They're a combined story about higher prices and shaken expectations, plus collapsing trust, plus more time spent alone, all amplified by a media and social ecosystem that is really good at keeping our nervous systems on edge. Inflation makes today feel harder to afford. Social media makes tomorrow feel harder to reach because you're constantly watching other people's highlight reels and comparing your bloopers to their best moments. Declining confidence in institutions makes people feel like nobody is in charge, or worse, that people in charge don't deserve the job. And isolation weakens the basic community buffers that help humans cope with stress. In other words, even if the economy is good, life can feel precarious, untrustworthy, and emotionally loud. If you're listening and thinking, okay, but what do we do with that? Thompson maintains the first step is simply to take the feelings seriously without treating them as irrational. A lot of this sadness is a signal. It's pointing to affordability pressure, to the importance of social connection, to the need for trustworthy institutions, and to the dangers of living in a permanent state of mediated crisis. The pandemic may have ended as a public health emergency, but as a social force, it left behind a new baseline, more expensive, more isolated, more distrustful, and more overwhelmed. And until we address those conditions, we shouldn't be surprised if Americans keep answering the happiness question the same way, with a number that's lower than the country's bank account would suggest. Now to the fight back. The International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers launched its Workers vs. Billionaires campaign this past Tuesday, marking its 138th anniversary with a rally in Maryland led by President Brian Bryant. The campaign aims to mobilize members nationwide ahead of the midterm elections, emphasizing growing inequality and corporate influence, with Bryant stating, quote, "Today we are living through the greatest concentration of wealth in history, and warning that a wealthy elite is using its power to buy politicians, break unions, offshore jobs, and gut the regulations that protect working families." The effort frames the current economy as one dominated by corporate greed and calls for coordinated action across industries and regions to push back. Speakers at the event highlighted labor's history of struggle and collective wins, with Maryland State and D.C. AFL-CIO President Donna Edwards noting, quote, "Nothing has ever been given to labor. We have fought for everything," reinforcing the campaign's message that worker gains require ongoing collective action. Overall, the initiative positions the union as reigniting its historic mission, dating back to its 1888 founding, to confront economic inequality and advocate for working people against concentrated wealth and corporate power. And we go across the sectors for worker actions, beginning in Indiana, where the Northern Indiana Public Service Company, or NIPSCO, has reached an agreement with the United Steelworkers, ending a lockout that had been in place for an entire month. NIPSCO announced the negotiations had come to an end, and clerical employees would return to work this past Tuesday. Negotiations began in January in preparation for the March 31st expiration of a contract between the two parties. When they weren't able to immediately reach a collective bargaining agreement, NIPSCO's lockout against union members ensued on April 2nd. The announcement follows the April 24th agreement for the physical bargaining unit. Those employees returned to work last week, according to the release. In total, the lockout kept more than 1,600 employees from work and prompted strikes across northern Indiana. Quote, "These agreements reflect our commitment to the safety of our workforce and customers, along with the reliability of our service," Vince Parisi, president and CEO of NIPSCO, said in the press release. "We are glad our employees are coming back to work, and as one NIPSCO, we'll be focused on the work ahead together." So, we'll see about that. Next, we go over to Illinois, where a group of zoo workers walked off the job this past Monday morning in Brookfield. They included grounds, custodial, and facilities employees.
Judy, Teamsters Local 727 set up camp outside the entrance to the zoo very early this morning. They say they've been negotiating with the zoo for a new contract since February. And when the last offer that they made was rejected on Friday night, they say they had no choice but to walk out. A union supporter honks as the driver leaves the entrance at Brookfield Zoo. Several dozen Teamsters gathered at the entrance holding signs indicating they're on strike. That strike began at 5 o'clock this morning. For many of the union members, zoo officials say they're attempting to run operations as normal today.
The world-class institution these members have created, you're not going to see that right now. And I really wish they would close to the public during this time. Inside the zoo, visitors tell me a couple of attractions, including the dolphin show and the carousel, are closed. But otherwise, they say it seems pretty normal.
I saw the strikers. I didn't even know that they were for the zoo at first until after we got rushed through. They had a cop there waving everybody through quick. Had no idea that it was even a strike for the zoo. Teamsters leaders say there are three main issues they're concerned with, including increased staffing guarantees, also employer fully paid health care, and cost of living wage increases.
Everything's going up. Gas is going up. Rent is going up. They're asking for a fair increase that is the same as all the other things that are going up.
Brookfield Zoo leadership has responded with a written statement saying, in part, we are working in good faith to reach a fair and responsible agreement, one that continues to support competitive wages and affordable, sustainable health care coverage. Union leaders and zoo officials both say caring for the animals is a top priority, and animal care specialists have not currently joined the strike. Zoo officials say they are committed to remaining open for visitors. You guys had a good experience, though, or no?
Oh, yeah. Yep. We like coming here. We love the zoo. So it's always a good time.
Union leaders say they hope to return to the bargaining table soon, but they say the next move is up to zoo officials. Zoo officials say they are committed to finding a constructive path forward. Live in Brookfield, John Garcia, ABC 7 Eyewitness News.
And by Wednesday, both sides announced they had reached a 4-year tentative agreement, bringing workers back on the job and restoring normal operations. Details of the deal were not immediately released, but union leaders said it addresses key concern over wages and the long-term stability of health care coverage. The dispute centered in part on the zoo's contributions to the Teamsters Health and Welfare Fund, which currently allows workers to pay no out-of-pocket health care costs. The union had argued contributions were too low to sustain that benefit, while the zoo maintained its payments were fair. Ah, there it is again. Health care costs holding up negotiations. Funny how much easier it would be if health care was not tied to your job, right? Wages and executive compensation were also points of contention. The zoo's previous offer included raises of less than 4%, which the union said did not reflect the cost of living in the Chicago area. Now up to Maine, where the state AFL-CIO reports staff at the Space Gallery in Portland announced on Friday, May 1st, that the organization voluntarily recognized their new union with UAW Local 2110, Technical, Office, and Professional Union. The 21 staff workers filed to join UAW 2110 in February and received voluntary recognition shortly thereafter. SPACE is a nonprofit organization that supports contemporary arts projects, champions artists, and encourages an open exchange of ideas. In a statement, the staff says, quote, "Our decision to unionize is a reflection of our institutional values and principles at SPACE and a natural step forward for our nearly 25-year-old nonprofit organization. We believe that joining UAW 2110 will only strengthen SPACE, solidify our future, and ensure we continue presenting arts, artists, and ideas for years to come. It's significant to us all to be joining the wider labor movement now, at a time when so many creative spaces and institutions are under attack. At SPACE, we're a staff of creative and passionate people. We care deeply about where we work, the artists we present, the audiences we serve, and the community we stand with. We host 200-plus events per year and are unified in our desire to ensure that SPACE endures as a premier arts institution in Maine's largest city. We're excited to embark on this new era together. Our member-supported model fuels our work and will directly help support our labor. We encourage you to become a SPACE member and stand in solidarity with us." Unfortunately, not all employers are so understanding. Developers working on Magic the Gathering Arena at Wizards of the Coast, organized as United Wizards of the Coast CWA, say the company and its parent Hasbro declined to voluntarily recognize the union after a May 1st deadline passed. The union stated, quote, "That deadline is now come and gone, with no direct response from the company," criticizing management by adding that while leadership claims to value employees, when we spoke up about our desire to unionize, they responded only to the press. Workers say they have majority support and are seeking improvements like layoff protections and limits on AI use, and have already filed for an NLRB election to force recognition if necessary. Meanwhile, the company has indicated it's reviewing the request and emphasized its belief in maintaining a direct relationship with its employees, even as union organizers continue to push forward, asserting, quote, "We still maintain that the success of our union is inevitable." And workers at the Portland Japanese Garden are still negotiating their first union contract nearly 2 years after organizing, with talks ongoing and key issues like wages and benefits unresolved. According to union representatives, employees would prefer to avoid a strike, but have not ruled one out as negotiations continue without a final agreement. The dispute centers on securing better pay and working conditions for a small group of cafe and gift shop workers, while management has indicated it's continuing to bargain. The prolonged timeline yet again reflects broader challenges in first-year contract campaigns, with both sides still working toward a deal but no clear resolution yet in sight. So look at the different workers involved in organizing here. NIPSCO includes linemen, service technicians, maintenance workers, and clerical workers. Then zoo workers, space gallery workers, video game developers, and gift shop and cafe workers out there at the Portland Japanese Garden. That's quite a variety, and something we have to appreciate about the labor movement today. The breadth really is impressive when you look at it from that perspective. Every worker deserves a union, and increasingly, more and more workers agree. Now let's dig into a political argument that keeps popping up in Democratic circles. Are we choosing between abundance and unions? Between building faster and protecting workers? A new report says that framing is backwards. It argues that organized labor isn't a roadblock to building big things. It can be one of the strongest tools we have for getting them done, and for doing it in a way that actually benefits regular people. This debate's been simmering for a while, but it's getting louder because the next presidential cycle is basically already starting. You can feel it in the way ideas are being tested and branded, long before anyone votes. And one of the hottest brands right now is abundance, the idea that Democrats should prove they can deliver. More housing, more infrastructure, more clean energy, more of the basics people need, and do it without endless delays. But abundance also carries baggage. For some people, it's become shorthand for a kind of centrist, deregulation-first approach. For others, it's a welcome corrective to a politics that can feel stuck, where everyone agrees that we need housing, but nothing gets built. Everyone wants modern infrastructure, but projects take forever. Everyone has plans, but outcomes don't change. So you end up with an emerging fault line, the abundance camp versus the populist camp, as if the country has to pick between build and fair. You can see the abundance language showing up in how some governors talk. Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro has been highlighting his push to cut red tape and move quickly, basically selling competence and speed as a governing philosophy. California Governor Gavin Newsom has been pushing an aggressive plan to build more housing, trying to force the state's pipeline to match the scale of its crisis. And right there in the middle of all this is a question that keeps coming up. Where do unions fit? Because in practice, state building agendas and union priorities sometimes collide. Newsom's housing ambitions have run into friction with labor concerns. Shapiro, meanwhile, has tried to argue there's no inherent reason unions can't be part of moving faster. So which is it? Are unions a natural partner for an abundance agenda, or are they a speed bump? A new report from the Roosevelt Institute lands firmly on the side of partnership. It's written by two labor scholars, Kate Andreas and Alex Hurdle Fernandez, and it makes the case for what they call democratic abundance. The core premise is simple. If you want to build a lot quickly, and in a way that strengthens society rather than dividing it, labor needs to be in the room from the start, not dragged in at the end. Their timing isn't random. May Day was a moment when worker politics became visible again. It also arrived as there's renewed energy around union organizing in the U.S., and as broader protest movements linked arms with labor for May Day actions. The report is basically stepping into a live argument and saying, stop treating workers as an afterthought in the build more conversation. One of the authors put it in a way that gets to the heart of the blind spot. If the goal is to produce the outcomes abundance advocates want, more housing, more infrastructure, more functioning public systems, then why would you leave out the organizations that represent the people who actually do that work? Now, if you've heard criticisms of unions from certain corners of the abundance world, they usually sound like this. Unions make projects more expensive, add delays, and complicate approvals, especially with housing. The report pushes back on that idea in a very practical way. First, it points out that high construction costs in the U.S. can't be pinned on unions alone. In fact, there are countries with stronger union membership that build for less. And within the U.S., costs have grown even in places without strong union presence. That's a clue that other factors, like supply issues, contracting structures, land costs, permitting systems, financing, and market dynamics are doing a lot of the work here. Second, the report takes on the broader interest group critique. Abundance proponents sometimes lump unions into the same bucket as any organized constituency that has power and uses it. But unions are unusual in one key respect. They're required to operate democratically. Their elections and internal governance have legal requirements behind them. That doesn't make unions perfect, but it does matter when we're asking whether they represent people in a meaningful way or just speak for a narrow slice of insiders. What's more interesting, though, is the report's positive case, why unions can actually help abundance succeed. For one thing, unions are a pipeline for skilled labor. If you want to repair bridges, build transit, upgrade the grid, retrofit buildings, or build housing at scale, the limiting factor is often not political will, it's workforce capacity. Trade unions run some of the strongest training programs in the country for exactly the jobs that big infrastructure and housing plans rely on. If you're trying to build quickly, having a ready workforce with training standards, apprenticeships, and credentials is not a nuisance, it's an advantage. Then there's the question of community buy-in. One of the reasons Project Stall isn't just bureaucracy, it's conflict. People worry that a project won't reflect community needs, or that it will displace residents, or that it will enrich developers without improving local life. When that happens, you get backlash, lawsuits, and endless procedural fights. Unions can help here too, the report argues, because they're membership organizations rooted in communities. They can be a bridge between project planners and residents, helping build confidence that jobs will be good jobs, that safety standards will be real, and that the benefits won't flow only upward. The report's takeaway is pretty blunt. If you want an abundance agenda to move fast, one of the fastest moves is to bring unions in early, so you're building a coalition instead of buying a fight later. But the report goes beyond speed and logistics and asks a more moral and political question. Abundance for whom? Because you can absolutely imagine a version of build more that doesn't improve life for working people. You can build housing that's unaffordable. You can build infrastructure with unsafe job sites. You can build quickly while wages stagnate. You can create a boom that mostly rewards landowners, financiers, and contractors at the top. And if that happens, then abundance becomes another word for growth that bypasses the people it's supposed to benefit. This is where Andreas and Hertel Fernandez emphasize that workers need representation embedded in policymaking. It's not just about having more projects. It's about making sure working conditions are safe, pay is fair, and the job creation that comes with building is broadly shared. If the conversation is dominated by policymakers and academics and political professionals, it's easy for worker needs to get treated like a side constraint, something to manage rather than something to prioritize. And you can see that argument echoing in the way some politicians talk about rebuilding union power right now. There are lawmakers pushing plans that would make it easier to unionize and give workers more leverage, not only as an economic strategy, but as a democratic one. The idea is that unions don't just win better pay, they build durable civic power for people who otherwise feel invisible. That democracy angle is central to the report. The authors argue that when workers feel powerless, when they feel economically squeezed and politically ignored, they become easier targets for right-wing populism. And in the current moment, with Trump back in the center of national life, that's not an abstract concern. The report frames a strong labor movement as a counterweight, a way to pull people into collective decision-making and give them a real stake in institutions again. This helps explain why major protest organizing against Trump has been increasingly entwining itself with labor actions, especially around May Day. The logic is that worker solidarity isn't just a workplace issue. It's a part of how you defend democratic life when it's under stress. If your political system is fraying, one of the ways you reinforce it is by strengthening organizations that teach participation, leadership, and shared interest. So when you zoom out, the report's making two arguments at once. The first is performance. If Democrats want to prove they can govern, build, and deliver tangible improvements, then unions can be a practical partner, training workers, setting standards, helping projects gain legitimacy so they don't get tied up for years. The second argument is deeper. A labor movement isn't only a tool for wages or benefits. It's a way of rebuilding democratic muscle. It brings workers into the governing process. It makes politics feel less like something that happens to people and more like something people can shape. And that brings us back to the so-called choice we started with. Unions or abundance? The report says that's the wrong question. If you want abundance that lasts, abundance that doesn't trigger backlash, doesn't deepen inequality, and doesn't leave people behind, You need the organizations that represent workers to help design it. So from May Day, maybe the clear way to frame it is this. Building a country that works isn't just about pouring concrete faster. It's about building the coalition that makes progress durable, skilled workers, democratic institutions, and policies that spread the gains. That's not abundance versus unions. That's abundance with a backbone. Okay, that being said, we're told the big debate is abundance versus unions, as if the only thing standing between us and a functioning society is whether the people doing the work get a say in it. But maybe that's the wrong fight entirely, because while we've been arguing about whether workers have too much influence, there's another group that's quietly had plenty of it for decades and somehow never gets framed as the problem. The people who design the system, manage it, optimize it, profit from it, brand it with words like efficiency and innovation, then act shocked when regular people feel squeezed by the results. In other words, winners of the modern economy, or if you prefer the classic term, the yuppies. Because if you really want to understand how we ended up with an economy that demands everything from workers while promising just enough to keep them running, you have to go back to the moment we decided this was normal. And yep, it involves Patagonia vests. Picture a familiar scene. A cluster of 20-somethings moving with purpose down a Manhattan sidewalk. Office badges swinging, matching vests stitched with a bank's logo. Maybe you've been stuck behind them while they debate the exact specifications of a drink order. Maybe you've overheard a conversation about Pilates, marathon training, and the unreal short ribs they had last night. We have newer words for this vibe now, but the old one still fits surprisingly well. Yuppies. Yuppie is short for young urban professional, and it really took hold in the 1980s. Back then it meant the rising class of bankers, lawyers, and other credentialed strivers who piled into big cities, earned big paychecks, and bought into a particular lifestyle. Loft apartments, sushi and wine, high-end kitchen gadgets, a kind of polished consumption that signaled you'd made it or were about to. People were fascinated by them, and at the same time disgusted. They were envied, mocked, and blamed. In plenty of cities, anti-yuppie graffiti wasn't subtle. But here's the uncomfortable twist. It's possible we laughed off the yuppies a little too early, because a lot of what feels normal in American professional life today, our obsession with elite credentials, the overwork culture, the self-optimization craze, the foodie arms race, even the way many neighborhoods have changed, was shaped in that yuppie-heavy moment. The 1980s didn't just create a stereotype. They helped lock in a deal that still governs the lives of millions. Work extremely hard, compete relentlessly, and you might win a comfortable life, while the gap between winners and everyone else widens in the background. So where did yuppies come from? They didn't just appear because young people suddenly discovered a love for Chardonnay. They were pulled into existence by an economy being rewired. In the late 70s and 80s, deregulation and political choices helped finance grow in power. Wall Street started capturing a larger share of profits than older industries like manufacturing. Investment banks and big law firms stopped being mere helpers to corporations and increasingly becoming the engines driving corporate decisions, mergers, breakups, takeovers, restructurings, offshoring, the whole machine designed to squeeze short-term value out of legacy companies. And that machine needed labor. Not just a few brilliant masterminds, but armies of young people to do the grinding work. Drafting, proofreading, building documents, checking numbers, reviewing contracts. The professional economy needed foot soldiers. That's why recruiters stormed the campuses of elite universities. The shift was dramatic. At places like Wharton, Yale, and Princeton, Wall Street turned from a niche path into a mass destination. Students lined up in the cold for a shot at interviews. The whole scene started to resemble a funnel. Get into the right school, land the right first job, and maybe you're in. One of the most important parts of this story is who was allowed through that funnel. The traditional pipeline, especially in top schools, couldn't supply enough of the old white upper-class male workforce to staff the booming deal economy. So banks and law firms widened the net. First, more white ethnic groups that had been excluded from the highest status corridors. Then as universities themselves became more diverse, more women and more Black, Latino, and Asian graduates entered these professions in large numbers. In that era's ruthless workplace logic, identity mattered less than pedigree, stamina, and a willingness to hand over your life to the job. A vivid example is Robert Jen, raised in a Chinese immigrant family in New York. He wasn't someone who arrived at college dreaming of junk bonds. He saw a finance executive speak, got pulled in by opportunity and momentum, and wound up on Wall Street almost by accident. That accidental quality matters because it hints at something people often forget. A lot of meritocracy isn't a pure talent contest. It's also timing, recruitment, signals, and a system that steers people once they're near the right doors. But the new, more diverse Yuppie workforce didn't necessarily get a better deal. Many were expected to work longer, do narrower tasks, and face thinner odds of reaching the top. Training was often less meaningful. Promotions were harder. As the professional world diversified at the entry level, it also became more intense, and in many cases, more miserable. This wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. Extraction was the point. The leaders of these institutions were building an efficient system for maximum output from ambitious young professionals. And that brings us to one of the biggest Yuppie legacies, the modern credential rat race. When elite universities became the key to elite jobs, the fight to get into those schools escalated. Families began treating admissions like a multi-year campaign. In a society with growing inequality, a spot at the top institution started to look like a ticket, maybe not to the top 1%, but to a stable upper-middle-class life. And because there were only so many tickets, the competition became zero-sum. Someone's win was someone else's loss. Once inside the professional world, new Yuppies were also sold a story that still dominates today. If you work hard enough, you'll rise. It's an appealing narrative, especially for people breaking barriers. Consider Nancy Lieberman, who graduated from a top law school and joined a fast-rising firm doing mergers and acquisitions. She worked punishing weeks on enormous deals, and she described a culture where what mattered most was performance, the sense that excellence could override sexism, or at least that you could outrun it by being undeniably good. That belief in merit can be empowering. It can also obscure how the structure is designed, not to nurture people, but to use them. What's really striking is how the Yuppie deal spilled over from work into leisure. This was the era when endurance events, especially the marathon, became a kind of status activity for professionals. Not casual jogging for health or peace of mind, but disciplined, scheduled training that looked a lot like career preparation. The logic was familiar. Results matter, excuses don't. Perform or go home. If you're hearing echoes of today's self-tracking culture, wearables, optimization, supplement snacks, you're not imagining it. The Yuppie era planted early seeds of the idea that free time should also be productive. City leadership loved this. Big signature events like the New York City Marathon became advertisements for a reborn urban identity after the crises of the 1970s. The televised image was powerful. A thriving city filled with energetic, white-collar professionals running through the streets like the place was safe, exciting, and open for business. In a sense, cities began planning their futures around attracting and keeping these professionals, paying them well, building housing for them, and creating playgrounds for their tastes. In many places, that dynamic never went away. Food was another arena where Yuppies reshaped culture. The modern foodie identity, where what you eat signals knowledge, sophistication, even morality, didn't come from nowhere. It was fueled by disposable income and a kind of cosmopolitan literacy, knowing which ingredients, cuisines, and restaurants counted as refined. Tools emerged to organize that knowledge, like restaurant guides built for busy professionals. Grocery stores followed the money too, reinventing themselves as upscale experiences, sort of the department store version of a supermarket. And once the market trained people to chase gourmet status, the cycle reinforced itself. Then there's politics. Yuppies didn't just change neighborhoods and brunch menus. They helped shift the Democratic Party. Over time, the party's center of gravity moved away from labor unions and the older New Deal coalition and toward college-educated metropolitan professionals. A different style of liberalism gained power, more faith in technocratic management, innovation, and a high-growth economy, and less emphasis on redistribution or aggressive regulation. The argument was that society should work like the best parts of the professional meritocracy, competitive, efficient, and led by credentialed experts. By the 1990s and beyond, Yuppie money and Yuppie attention became central to national politics. Candidates increasingly needed professional class donors and professional class approval. Wall Street and elite law became major political funding engines. You can draw a line from that transformation to the modern map of American political tension. Dense, high-income urban areas leaning Democratic, many working-class, rural, and post-industrial areas moving away. Of course, the rise of the Yuppie came with a brutal trade-off. Yes, elite spaces became more inclusive in race, gender, and ethnicity than they had been in earlier decades, but mainly for people who could survive the gauntlet. The right schools, the right internships, the right early jobs, the right polish, the right tolerance for long hours and constant evaluation. That selective inclusion had a side effect. It made a rapidly unequal society easier to tolerate because the faces at the top looked more diverse, even as the distance between top and bottom grew. And inequality wasn't abstract. It showed up in the places the Yuppies moved. Across major cities, Yuppie migration was paired with intense gentrification. When higher-income professionals arrived, property values jumped, and landlords had every incentive to renovate, reposition, and replace existing tenants. Sometimes displacement happened politely with buyouts. Often it happened through harassment. And in some of the ugliest cases, it happened through violence, like arson used to clear buildings, leading to deaths and mass displacement. If you want a chilling reminder that neighborhood change isn't always a gentle process, that's it. Many Yuppies still found ways to rationalize what was happening around them. It's a common mental move to treat harm as an unfortunate side effect of progress. You hear versions of it all the time. People say they don't want anyone to suffer. Of course not. They like the neighborhood to be a nicer place. And that word, nicer, often hides what's really being said. Wealthier, whiter, more comfortable for people like me. Over the decades, the industries associated with Yuppies shifted. Finance dominated the 1980s, then consulting surged, then tech took center stage. But the broader pattern accelerated. Professional class wealth rose. Portfolios benefited from the same economic changes that hollowed out other kinds of work, and the distance between people with credentials and people without them grew wider. Eventually, that hierarchy produced resentment. In the 2010s, a strain of populist conservatism positioned itself against almost everything the Yuppie dream represented: diversity initiatives, elite education as a sorting system, globalized finance, cosmopolitan culture, even the idea that cities are the country's moral and cultural center. Some of that backlash was rooted in real economic damage done to working-class communities. Some of it was psychological, humiliation, loss of status, and the feeling of being looked down on by an urban professional class that seemed to write the rules. Race and geography supercharged that resentment, and it wasn't only low-income people who joined it. There were also plenty of locally wealthy, less credentialed business owners, people who felt rich in their towns but dismissed by elite national culture. Into that mix stepped Trump, who had his own long history with the Yuppie world, close enough to it to crave its respect, yet often rejected by it as too brash, too flashy, too outer borough. In politics, that bitterness became fuel, and his aesthetic of contempt lined up neatly with the contempt many supporters felt in return. Here's where the story gets even more complicated. The people we used to call Yuppies are now both dominant and vulnerable. Political attacks on diversity programs and affirmative action threaten the pipeline that helped women and racial minorities enter high-status professions. If formal pathways shrink, hiring can tilt back toward informal networks, connections, nepotism, and subjective fit, which usually favor the already privileged. The professional class could become less open and more inherited, a club where the children of the rich take the seats. And then there's AI. If you want a modern parallel to the descaling and downsizing that reshaped industrial labor in the late 20th century, this might be it. A lot of the entry-level professional work, the kind that used to train young analysts, junior associates, and early career strivers, can be partially automated or radically compressed. If those bottom rungs disappear, what happens to the promise of upward mobility? For many people, even a stable upper-middle-class life could start to look fragile. So what happens if Yuppies, today's version of them, start to feel endangered? One possible outcome is solidarity. If professional workers realize they share insecurity with other workers, not just with the corporate elite above them, coalitions can shift. You can already see hints of this in political alliances that bring together downwardly mobile professionals and working-class strivers, people who are tired of being told to compete with each other while the gains concentrate at the top. An AI-driven shakeup could expand that constituency dramatically. But even for the yuppies who won, the story has never been purely triumphant. The meritocratic grind that paid for the apartment, the schooling, the lifestyle, it carried a psychological bill. Long hours, constant judgment, the pressure to keep climbing, the sense that if you stop running, you fall behind. A lot of people didn't feel victorious. They felt exhausted, burned out, like the prize kept moving. In a way, yuppies were the first young cohorts pulled deeply into what you might call the sweatshop of meritocracy, a system that produces comfort for some by demanding relentless labor, constant self-management, and an acceptance of broader inequality as the background condition of success. And that leaves us with a final question worth sitting with. If a class identity like the yuppie could be built through policy, economics, culture, and institutions, can it also be dismantled or reshaped? Maybe the real task now is to renegotiate the bargain, to keep what was genuinely good about opening doors and expanding opportunity, without accepting exploitation, burnout, and widening inequality as the necessary price. History suggests nothing about this arrangement is permanent. If it was made, it can be unmade. And let's close, of course, with recognition of the great unpaid labor that carries such importance in society: motherhood. It wouldn't hurt you guys to take a load off her once in a while, and you do the laundry, or cook dinner, or take care of the dirty dishes piled up in the sink. Shared labor is how it should be done, after all. Happy wife, happy life. Just letting her relax a little more would probably go a long way to doing the trick. So that's all for this episode. Thanks for watching, and to my audio people, thanks for listening. Please like and share so I can get this message out to more of our brothers and sisters, and hit that subscribe button. I'll see you again next week. Solidarity, always.